Hey everyone, so great to see everybody's videos last week, hear your voices, see your faces. And going forward, even when I ask for, some kind of response to a reading or something, you're always welcome to deliver that as a video instead of writing it up if you prefer. It's okay if it's a little more messy because of that or whatever. I think that after being together in the Wemanooch, it's always nice to see each other on the screen. So we are coming into week 8, and for the next 2 weeks we're going to be reading together a book called For the Beauty of the Earth by Steve Booma Prediger. And Steve is someone I know. He's a Fuller alum, actually, teaching at Hope College. I used his class, which I guess is pretty well known at Hope College. It's a class that includes significant time out in the Adirondacks together. I used that to give me some guidance in planning our immersion part of this course. Anyway, this book in some ways deals with the broad topic of our course a little bit more systematically, you might say. It tries to give a kind of general introduction to the Christian calling to care for our places. I think you'll find the wilderness theme to be present, if not necessarily primary. But hopefully by this point in the course you have enough thinking about wilderness that you can see how it is relevant and being dealt with in all kinds of ways implicitly, even if it's not the explicit subject of something. I want to point out a couple of, what shall I call them? I guess they're sort of liabilities or concerns that I want to raise for you as you get started with this book. One of them is the scale that the book is concerned with. The book is dealing quite extensively with what we might call the global ecological crisis. So, thinking about the Earth as a planet and thinking about ecological difficulties on a planetary scale. And you can probably tell it is easy to be overwhelmed by that kind of presentation. And I think that experience is important for us because there are indeed planetary dimensions to some of the ecological problems that we have inherited and are perpetuating. And it really is a crisis, I think it's fair to say, on that kind of a global scale. Nevertheless, there's a reason why I have oriented this class to a focus on your particular place, because I think that our sense of agency as well as our Christian calling is tied to our particular places. And sometimes thinking about ecological crisis on a global scale can sort of relativize our commitment to our particular place or the stakes that we see in our life, in our particular places. So as much as I want you to be influenced by sort of the global dimensions of ecological crisis, I'm more concerned in the class for you to see, as I'm glad to see many of you are, to see what challenges you face in your own bodily life, in your own place, in your own home, with your own neighbors, human and non-human. I think that being bodily beings that are measured by our place is something that we have to take seriously when it comes to the Christian calling to justice and to being people who care for our places and our neighbors. There's a reason why the sort of central command of God's law, as Jesus himself emphasizes for us, is to love your neighbor as yourself. The point is not to say that you're not called to love everybody. We are called to love everybody. But being the limited bodily beings that we are, we can't love everyone meaningfully in the same way. And so we learn to love by loving those with whom our body interacts and taking those bodily encounters seriously as the calling of God. So while this book is going to focus our minds on a more global scale, I hope that you'll keep in mind the urgency of maintaining a neighborly concentration when it comes to our calling to be earth keepers, and also to discern how the wilderness informs that calling in our own places. So that's the one concern I wanted to highlight. The second one, maybe I have two more, geez. The second one is, I think, something that is really lacking in this book that's been an emphasis in our class to this point, and that is the systematic relationship between white dominance and ecological devastation. Steve is not totally oblivious to that, but it's not worked into the argument of the book very well, in my view. And this is not to imply, right, that there are not ecological problems historically or in places of the world that are not so affected directly by white dominance. There are, but I don't think that we can understand the ecological difficulties that we face, the people of our class, without making race a systematic question of concern and study. So that is something that we will need to add to the presentation of this book, and maybe to reflect on together in the forum for this week and next week too. I guess it's the last chapter that I have assigned for this week, although you might go a little beyond it in an effort to read the first half of the book. But I think it's chapter 3 of the book that asks, is, the environmental crisis or ecological devastation, is Christianity to blame for that? And the tendency of the chapter is to assume that question as a kind of attack on the Christian faith that is to be defended against. And rightly, Steve includes some important acknowledgement of the truth to that accusation, but he still presents that chapter as primarily a defense of Christianity against that charge. And I just don't think that that's the best way to read what's in that chapter, to be honest with you. I think it makes more sense to read it as here are some important complaints about Christianity that Christians like you and I should take very seriously, and actually not be so defensive about, and be more concerned to see how those accusations stick and how we might respond to them in the way that we live and teach the Christian life. That, I think, is a more useful framework for profiting from what is in that chapter. Also, I think another shortcoming of that chapter, in my view, is its apparent unawareness of the historic relationship between the economic systems that have dominated the Western world for the last 300 to 400 years and the Christian tradition. Steve talks about Adam Smith and John Locke and the very unchristian things that he finds in their philosophy, which is seminal in the capitalist economic systems that predominate today. But I think he neglects the fact that actually Adam Smith and John Locke were both Christians, and their economic theory is deeply embedded in their Christian theology. So that instead of saying that it's not Christian, I think it would be wiser to say we need to engage in a kind of theological critique of the sort of economics propounded by Adam Smith and John Locke. And again, they're pretty sophisticated philosophers in their time, very influential, and we should do our best, I think, to try to understand what they were up to and the real sophistication that there is in some of their thinking, especially in Adam Smith, I'd say. I don't think Steve gives a very sound presentation of Adam Smith's philosophy, even if there's also a lot in there I'd like to criticize. He was a philosopher who saw economics for what it was, as a kind of moral formation. And so anyway, take those kind of concerns with you as you read this book by Steve Booma Prediger, For the Beauty of the Earth, and we'll just have one response forum on that this week. Nothing else to do but to read that and to respond in the forum. I'll probably have a podcast for you again to just engage the topics of those initial chapters. I'll make that optional, of course, because I think you got enough on your plate. You'll see in the prompt for the forum that I want you to respond to the book, but I also want you to be thinking about how to use the book, the thoughts that it provokes in you as you're beginning to put together your final paper for our class, and to use the forum as an opportunity to invite input for your ideas, your paper from other students and from me. So for these next 2 weeks, we're hopefully going to be resources for one another as you're trying to get a clearer sense of what you want to say in your paper about how you are learning from the wilderness to promote care as a Christian for your place, in your place. So that will be what we'll be up to in the forum for this week. I look forward to your thoughts, your reactions to the book, and where you're beginning to think for your papers. So have a great week.